Well, hello, folks, and happy Valentine's Day. And as you know, we have a very appropriate story today, a colonial love story that's going to be told to us, as I said, in verbal technicolor by Erin Adams, who's the Director of Education at the Hermitage. Erin?
Well, thank you all. Verbal Technicolor seems like a bit of a challenge. Well, we'll see how it goes. The images are very colorful anyway, so we'll hope so. Well, thank you again to Ms. Roseman and for having me back. I spoke a few months ago. Thoroughly enjoyed the event at Green Hills, and so it's a pleasure to be with you today. And the way I like to do things is as we go, if you have a question as we get to it, just throw your hand up. We don't have to wait till the end. Like that's all right with me. And if I need to wait till the end, then I'll let you know. But otherwise, feel free to toss out a comment, a question. I'm perfectly happy to do that. So today, being Valentine's Day, certainly it is very appropriate to talk about the love life of Rachel Donelson Robards Jackson, but that's a little bit misleading. We will talk about Andrew Jackson quite a bit. But as I have come to the Hermitage, I've worked there now almost 10 years, and so when I first took the job at the Hermitage, you know, I knew that I would have a learning curve when it came to Jackson, when it came to the presidency especially, and when it came to life at the Hermitage. But one thing that I thought I knew was about their love story, right? Everybody knows that Rachel Jackson was married before she married Andrew Jackson, that there was all this controversy over whether or not she had actually been divorced, when that happened, and then subsequently what that meant for Jackson's political career and the election, particularly the 1828 presidential election, and then how that, Jackson certainly felt, led to her death shortly before he was to leave to take office. So this was part of a story that I felt like I knew, right? Like, I'm not gonna have to learn anything about that, I got that. That couldn't be further from the truth. So as I started learning more and working with the story of the Jacksons in many forms over the last few years, one of the things that probably stresses me out the most is trying to get beyond the legend to get what's really underneath it, right? And unfortunately, from a historiography perspective, it doesn't help us that almost every biography, every biographical treatment of Rachel Jackson, it all seems to boil down to this story of her marriage, right? As if Rachel Jackson's entire story starts and ends with Andrew Jackson and maybe Lewis Robards, right? Again, couldn't be further from the truth. So what I wanted to do a little bit today is just try to get down below that part of it just a little bit and talk instead about Rachel and Andrew Jackson's marriage, what kind of brings them to one another, what it is that the other one lacks that the other one supplies, the ways in which they already had a lot of common ground coming into their marriage, and then just what the result of this is, right, in some very practical ways. So I was impressed with myself with this title, Distressed but No Damsel, right? Rachel Jackson is no damsel. Whatever version of a picture you've seen of Rachel Jackson, like you notice that pretty quickly. Like, this is not a damsel we are looking at, right? Nothing about that woman says, you know, delicate or dainty. You know, she is a woman of the frontier through and through. So I wanted to start first of all just by looking at the legend a little bit. So why have we, either as historians or just in society, why have we boiled down the story of Rachel and Andrew Jackson just to this controversy over whether or not she was divorced first? So a couple of images to share with you. The legend has been told and retold in so many formats over time. It is a story that you could take to a foreign country and they would probably recognize it, right? So some of the images that I selected for this, first of all, the one in the center, the President's Lady. This is the Italian language version of it. It was also translated into Spanish and to several other languages around the country. So the very famous 1954 film that starred Charlton Heston and Susan Hayward. When you look at that image, like, what stands out to you? What are some of the things that just sort of automatically capture your attention from that image?
She's running away.
She's running away. She's beautiful. Yeah, Rachel Jackson didn't look like Susan Hayward. There's fire. Okay, there's fire. Does anybody else think of the posters from Gone with the Wind? Yeah, absolutely. So you have this beautiful brunette, this low-cut dress, right? There's fire and flame in the background. She's fleeing. Who is she fleeing? Angry hordes and mobs of, people after her. Maybe they're Native American, maybe they're not. It's a little unsure what they're meant to represent. But then where's Charlton Heston? Where's Andrew Jackson? He is on that horse. He is on the horse. Every image of Jackson is on a horse, right? So he is on that horse, and he's about to swoop her up and take her off to safer places, right? And of course, like I said, this one was the Italian version of it. This was the image here to the right, Rachel's Man, was a play that was written about the Jacksons, specifically about their marriage, by the Works Progress Administration during the New Deal. This was an era in which you had all those wonderful outdoor historical dramas that were being written, like The Lost Colony at Roanoke or Unto These Hills, which is at Cherokee, North Carolina. Which are just my absolute favorite parts of American history. So you had one written about Rachel as well. But again, this is that same sort of tortured love story, right? Rachel trapped in a loveless marriage, trying to be a good person, wanting to do what's right, and just having to make that break anyway. And then the final one, I should have reordered these images, but the one then on your far left side, though, this is an image from the play Bloody, Bloody Andrew Jackson. I don't know if you're familiar with it. The Nashville Repertory Theater did it a few years ago over at TPAC, and it is wildly inaccurate and wonderful. I absolutely loved it. I find myself singing populism, quite a few times. So this is very much a rock and roll version of Rachel and Andrew Jackson's love story. If you can see very well, I've got a clicker. Let me see if that... So like right up here on her face, you can see where it's, literally bloody, and that like blood is dripping down her shirt, and Jackson has swooped her up into this passionate embrace. And, this is the stuff of rock and roll legend. This is the stuff of, Gone with the Wind-esque proportions of cinematic beauty and romance, right? This is what people know about Andrew Jackson and Rachel Jackson's marriage. And it's not hard to see why, right? Who doesn't want to hear that kind of love story? Who doesn't want, the damsel to be in distress and the hero just swoop her up, and take her off to safety? So, excuse me, that scene, by the way, from Bloody Bloody Andrew Jackson is a scene in which Rachel decides to leave Lewis Robards, because they've really leaned into the domestic violence angle of their marriage. And so that's why she's bleeding, is because she's just been beat up by her husband. So of course here comes Jackson to save her from that. Then we have stories that I think of as like legend light, right? They are historical, the details are accurate, but then they're just sort of presented in a way that's meant to exaggerate the story just a little bit. This image to the far, I'm going to blind myself with this. Okay, the image that's down here on the left in the yellow dress, this is one of my favorite images of the two of them, but it was never taken from life. This was an image painted of the Jacksons in 1831. It was done by the Reverend Henry Young, who lived in Pennsylvania and is of Pennsylvania Dutch origin. And so you have this beautiful folk art image of Rachel and Andrew Jackson. The words at the top say General Jackson and his lady. It is what folk artists refer to as a fraktur painting, so it comes from that Germanic decorative arts tradition. And you have this very young Jackson and this very young Rachel, and they are celebrating the outcome of the Battle of New Orleans. So, in New Orleans after the battle, there are many balls and many celebrations of this great victory. And this is where Rachel has now come to be at his side while they're having this celebration. So it's not even captured by Hollywood, right? Just down at the average citizen level, right? This legend is still incredibly powerful and strong. The one here in the middle, okay, you can see it. The one here in the middle, I had never seen this image of Rachel before until I was working on this to put this together today. By the time this image is created, Rachel Jackson has died. She has already passed away. And yet the background that you see, the column, the drapery, even the chair, is very typical of Jackson's presidential portrait, okay? So it almost presents an idea that Rachel Jackson is at the White House, that she's had a role to play in this political career, but you can kind of tell by her dress, if you look around, like the upper part of the bodice, the sleeves, it's a very old-fashioned dress by the time in which this image is supposed to represent. You have that Rachel was known for this veil type headdress that she would often wear, but when you look at, like, there's sort of like this little flower crown attached to it, also a very outdated mode of women's headwear by the time this image is created. And then she's holding a fan and a book in her hand. So it has been suggested that the artist of the image here in the center is instead mocking Rachel Jackson, right? That if she had come to the White House, like, here you've got this country bumpkin, right, that is now in the halls of power, and just, you know, what a statement that makes about the nation, to have this first lady who already comes with this questionable background, you know, of her marriage, and then she's a country bumpkin and she's outdated, and how does that portray the nation, right? How is our first lady going to portray us as such a backwards nation? This one, then the one here on the right side is, of course, the cover image of Patricia Brady's book that came out about 10 years ago called A Being So Gentle, The Frontier Love Story of Rachel and Andrew Jackson. Now, Patricia Brady is a bona fide historian. I don't want it to sound like I'm throwing her under the bus. I did not love this book. In fact, I threw it 3 times in the course of reading it. There's a big scuff on my bedroom wall because it just was making me angry. Patricia Brady also wrote that really wonderful biography of Martha Washington that came out about 2005, 2006, of her, independent of George Washington. And I was so excited when I knew that this book was coming, because I thought, finally, we're going to get a treatment of Rachel Jackson on her own terms, right? Where she's not just that damsel in distress that Jackson's always having to swoop up out of a problem somewhere. But the book was a little bit of a letdown, not because of her writing style, but because I feel like so many authors have been so directed by the legends that have developed over time that it is hard to get at the Rachel underneath them. So that is both a criticism of Miss Brady, but also of an understanding that as a scholar, it is hard to get past that sometimes. In most of the books that I have read about Jackson, I was thinking about the 3-volume biography set. Some of you may be familiar with written by Dr. Robert Remini, which is sort of the authoritative biography on Jackson, certainly the most comprehensive. But even in that book, for somebody who had a life's work in the Jackson papers, and yet the only way that Rachel Jackson emerges from this story is as this damsel in distress. That she's, you know, and so there's more scuffs on the bedroom wall where I've had to throw Remini a time or two. When he first introduces Rachel Jackson, he describes her appearance. It is fair to say that she and Andrew Jackson were physically the opposite. He was very tall and skinny. She was very short and a little heavy set. Okay, that's reality. But then every time Remini brings Rachel back into the story, he always starts with some characterization like stout Rachel, heavy Rachel. At one point he said obese Rachel, and then I knew I was like, I'd read as much as I needed to that night. So it just, there's sort of this characterization, this constant characterization of Rachel Jackson, either as somebody who needs saving, as somebody who's sort of a backwards yokel from the frontier of Nashville, or just as almost like an albatross around Jackson's neck in some way. So what I wanted for us to do today is try to move all past that legend, past the drama that all of that comes with, and just instead talk about their marriage and what is coming out of their marriage. So, open question to you. What matters in a real life love story? I mean, these were real people, right? They existed. This is not a Hollywood script. These are real people. So as people who enjoy history, who enjoy learning about the people of the past, what does it matter to you to know about their love story?
Money.
So you want to know whether money was involved, or how money was involved, or if money was involved? Is anybody bringing money into that relationship, right? Did he marry her for this great dowry that she came with? The answer is no on that. She comes with a dowry, but not money.
Truth matters.
The truth matters. Absolutely. I've been in relationships, you all have been in relationships, and one of the cardinal principles of being in a romantic relationship is that nobody really knows what that relationship is like if you're not one of the people in it, right? There's an interiority to that relationship that really isn't anybody else's business. Okay, but you want the truth, you want the truth. What else? Commitment? Right, you want to see where the commitment is between these two people who have entered.
What were the characteristics of each that seemed to work through time?
Absolutely. What keeps them together? What keeps them together?
Trust and communication.
How do they communicate with one another? What is that communication like? Honesty. All right, that's exactly what we're going to talk about then. Okay, so this really is what has gotten this idea started for me, is this idea that they come into their relationship with one another with a lot of common ground between them, okay? And in ways that I know I had not given them credit for, and in ways that I still haven't quite found the right biography, right, that takes advantage of, including Patricia Brady's book. So these are facts that most of us know about them already, but I wanted us to see kind of how they line up at various points. So Rachel Donelson, as we know, she's born Rachel Donelson. She is born in Pittsylvania County, Virginia, which is near the city of Chatham. It's kind of halfway between like Danville and Martinsville, if you're familiar with the state of Virginia. So it's along that southern boundary between Virginia and North Carolina. You're past the Tidewater at that point, so almost getting into the mountains. So it's Western Virginia. She's born in 1767, so this makes her and Andrew Jackson both the exact same age going into this. So, she's not very young while he's very old, or vice versa. So they're peers, absolutely, in terms of their age. Her family does come from bluer blood, if you will, than Jackson's did. No question about that. Her father, John Donelson, had already been serving in the Virginia House of Burgesses. So this was a man who had political ties and connections already. Her father, John Donelson, was awarded, or empowered is the right way, was empowered to do a lot of the surveying of the western territories of Virginia, and that included the state of Kentucky. The reason that the Donelsons get to Nashville partly is because her father has been very much involved in getting all the Transylvania Purchase established and bringing eastern Kentucky rather, into the ownership of Virginia. So she's lived in this Virginia frontier community. She had an infrequent education. It appears from the research that she went to school on and off, like many children in a frontier environment, would have gone partially throughout the year. She certainly knew how to read, how to write, how to run a household, but her education beyond that level was certainly not a factor in her upbringing. And whatever that status of her education was absolutely interrupted at the age of 13 when her family decides to make the journey to the Watauga settlement and then on to Fort Nashboro. Okay, so this is Rachel's upbringing, Andrew's upbringing, born in 1767, same year on the Carolina frontier. Now there are some differences. The Waxhaw frontier, right where the states of North and South Carolina join, kind of right below Charlotte, like that little notch on the top of South Carolina. Definitely more remote than Rachel's upbringing had been in terms of a frontier life, but tasks very much the same. The rates of mortality in these communities mostly the same. So understanding the labor it takes to establish a community in the frontier, the frequent loss of people, just the overall exchange of effort for reward in establishing frontier communities, they had both experienced and knew at this point. Same infrequent education. Jackson's education surprisingly exceeds, that's the word I'm looking for. Jackson's education actually exceeds Rachel's education. His mother had intended him to be a Presbyterian minister. She sends him to a private academy in the Waxhaws. It was called Bethel Academy. Now it was a step above the common grammar school. He's learning Latin and Greek. The school was taught by a minister, but Jackson really only achieves about the 6th grade level before then his life is monumentally interrupted by the Revolution. So at the age of 13, for both of them, here's what's happening. Rachel Jackson and her family have left Virginia. They have headed to the Watauga settlement, okay? Not an easy journey. They're having to cross the mountains to do so. That's going to pale in comparison to the journey to get them to Fort Nashboro. But her life has been picked up and uprooted and moved on. Jackson's age of 13. He is a veteran of the American Revolution by this point. He is a POW of the Revolution, the only of our presidents to have served as a prisoner of war. He loses his entire immediate family just a year later by the age of 14, and then he's horribly wounded during his arrest after the Battle of Hanging Rock, and also suffers with smallpox, right? So by the age of 14, Jackson is completely orphaned. He's had POW experience, he's been a combat veteran, and he's 14. He's not a child at this point, right? And so what is expected out of Jackson, what Jackson begins to expect out of himself at this point, is adulthood. Right? And Rachel, even though you could make the claim that Rachel, well, she still has her family with her, right? Her immediate family, her siblings, they're all together. When they go from Watauga to Fort Nashboro, of course, Donelson is the one leading the river voyage. They have just about hit starvation point by the time they finally make it to Nashboro. This is the equal of any epic pioneer westward expansion story, right? Rachel knows by the age of 13 what it is to lose people from epidemic disease. She knows what it's been like to be under the constant attack of Native Americans, right? It's part of that journey, as we know. The family, the boat journey, they all end up having to jettison so much of their earthly goods just to get them through the shoals around Muscle Shoals, Alabama. So by the time she gets to Fort Nashboro, she's 13 years old, and she has lived this westward epic, right? So for both of these people, by the age of 13, the age of 14, they're not children. They have had the kind of monumental, life-shaping experience that's going to govern everything else for them. And they both do that at the same age. So that's a lot of that common ground there. By the way, this image right here of the flotilla, of Donelson's flotilla, the shanty boat. I remember this being published in my 7th grade Tennessee history textbook. And I remember thinking how exotic Tennessee looks. You know, you've just, like, I know it doesn't really look like that, but it looks like that, right? Like, you've got the moon, and you've got just this lush forest on the mountains. And there was another image of the same Donelson journey a little bit later in the book, and it looked like some tropical landscape, you know, with just all of this foliage. And so when I think about this story, I think about those textbook images, yeah, they're entering into territory that they haven't been into before, right? Rachel's on a lifetime journey. Who knows what is beyond the boundaries of these places, right? So the two of them are experiencing this, obviously unconnected, but they're going to have a lot to share from their childhoods, right? I can already see it. So, you know, when you're forming that relationship, right, you start with common ground. What have you experienced? What has your, you know, what are some of your life experiences, and how has that shaped you as a human being? What has that left you eager for, or hungry for, or afraid of, right? We've all had these conversations. So then you enter into uncommon territory, or the baggage you bring with you into a relationship, and what that is going to mean for the other. Here's what Rachel Jackson brings to Andrew Jackson, I believe, in this case. First of all, she brings slavery. The Donelsons had been slave owners during their time in Virginia. John Donelson and his forebears had been slave traders and slave owners. So the ownership of people and the use of their labor and their work, and just the incorporation of enslaved people into daily life for the Donelsons was old news at this point. For Jackson, it was not. This was a new thought. Jackson lived in a frontier community that did not really lend itself to enslavement very well, because they are still trying to carve out a wilderness. Jackson's parents and his brothers did not own slaves. So the ownership and the use of slave labor was not something that Jackson had experienced before his marriage to Rachel. What else does Rachel bring with her? She brings land, and she brings connections. She also brings family. I'm going to show you them in just a minute. She also brings family. Jackson's entire family is gone. The remaining Jackson family that lived in North Carolina and in South Carolina had essentially treated Jackson like the hired help. So after the war and after his release from prison, he was being hired out by various family members. So he was constantly moving back and forth between family members. And it was very much in sort of a hired help capacity, not a our poor dear nephew, we love you, we want you to be part of our family, we're not going to let you go without, we're not, we're going to take you in as one of our own, was not really an aspect of Jackson's life once the war was over and he had returned home. So she brings family. The idea of what it means to grow up surrounded with a big group of siblings and parents who love you, and then all of those extensions, aunts, uncles, cousins, grandparents, right? The whole idea of a family life, Rachel provides for Andrew Jackson. One of my favorite treatments of what that does for Jackson comes from Mark Cheatham's book, Andrew Jackson's Southerner. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it because he spends a lot of time looking at just the idea of family and the idea that you have this network of people who hold your interest at heart and whose interest you hold at heart, and what that means for being able to then expand in other ways. Yes, ma'am?
What's the name of the book again?
So the name of the book was Andrew Jackson's Southerner, and it's by Dr. Mark Cheatham, who's a professor at Cumberland University. And it's a very comfortable read too. It's about 240 pages, so I highly recommend it if you're looking for a good book. What else does Rachel Jackson bring into this relationship? Well, she's married already, right? Lewis Robards, and they know that when they first meet. And of course, Jackson and Rachel first meet when Jackson is living at her mother's boarding house over where the Hobby Lobby at Rivergate is today. I think about that sometimes when I'm in there buying like last minute supplies for an Andrew Jackson program. But she brings land. She brings housing. She brings that sense of sort of real estate permanence into their relationship, which Jackson had never had before. And then she's actually going to bring land, because this document up here is a deed signed by the state of North Carolina, which of course predates the independent state of Tennessee, in which land is being transferred to Lewis Robards, Rachel's first husband, and the deed is being signed off. Look at the names on it. So we have got John Donelson, William Donelson, who's that bottom one? Edward Jennings, chairman. And yeah, so there's at least 2 Donelson signatures on this. So as land speculators and as real estate agents, essentially, the Donelsons have sold property to Robards, which then Rachel is going to live on as a newlywed bride. And then they're going to sell land in Kentucky as well. Do you know where the Hermitage originates from? Yes, sir.
The lower right signature, is that Daniel Smith, the surveyor that has rock cast?
Yes, it is. I'm so sorry. Yes, it is.
Andersonville?
Yes, so that's Daniel Smith's signature. It is. Thank you for pointing that out, because I'm going to go back to Daniel Smith in a moment. Do you know what this piece of property is today? The Hermitage. So the land that Jackson buys in order to start the Hermitage, he owns land before he buys the Hermitage, but when he buys the Hermitage, part of that land was owned by Lewis Robards. And this is 10 years after his marriage to Rachel. So it's just kind of the gift that keeps on giving in a way, right? Because, hey, I got your wife, I get your land. Like, I'm sure Jackson took a great deal of pleasure, in just sort of sticking that to Robards. I'm not going to lie about that. So Jackson ends up buying a section of Robards' property. So she's bringing land into the arrangement. And then, of course, she's bringing that marital experience. She's been married before. Jackson had not been married before. So she knows what it's like to live side by side with a person that you can't stand, right? It's like she comes in, which is true. I mean, she kind of comes in with this sense of, this has been my experience. And this is the road I'm not going to go back down, right? This is what I'm not going to put up with. This is what we're not going to do. So she's kind of gotten the example of what not to do when it comes to being married. And of course, when Robards and Rachel are finally legally divorced, Rachel is the guilty party in that she had committed adultery with Andrew Jackson. Now, I don't know that a lot of people know this, but it just, every time I say it, it's like I can't believe it. So when Rachel Jackson divorces Lewis Robards, when they separate first, and that's in 1791. They'd been married 6 years. At that point, Rachel was about 24 years old. They separated. The evidence seems to suggest that Robards clearly had what today would be a diagnosable mental illness, okay? His behavior is erratic, he is paranoid. There's some belief, at least on the part of Rachel's brothers, that he is violent towards her, although I haven't seen proof of that in writing. So it is a constant upheaval in their marriage. They live in Harrodsburg, Kentucky. When Robards just decides that he's had enough of Rachel for the moment, he sends her back to Nashville to live with her mother. And then when he gets over this sort of fit of pique he's worked himself into, he comes back and gets her, takes her back to Kentucky. So there's this kind of constant back and forth, of being banished back to Nashville. In fact, that's the conditions under which Rachel and Andrew Jackson first meet. She's been banished back to her mother's, and that's when they first meet. But by the time Rachel leaves Robards, and then she and Jackson do or don't get married legally in 1791, this comes up in 1793. Robards shows back up. He says, Rachel, what are you doing? We never really did get divorced. You're living with another man in sin. We've got to clear this up. And so at this point, Rachel just doesn't fight it. She's willing to be the guilty party. She's willing to let this happen if it will just happen. What is not noted in the historical record, at least not in the divorce decree, which had to be approved by the state of Virginia because Kentucky was a part of the state of Virginia. So the Virginia General Assembly is reading this document that names her as the adulteress. But what it doesn't note is that Lewis Robards had already remarried. And he had kids. So at this point, just get it over with is absolutely Rachel's mind. John Overton is the one who goes to Jackson and says, look, you're not making the situation any better because you all need to separate. You two need to cool it for a minute. Let this happen. Let this get finished and then remarry legally. And then whatever your plans for the future are, nobody can bring that marriage back against you. Right, that you had done this illegally. Well, of course they will, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. But yeah, Robards, just, okay, so what is the uncommon ground that Andrew Jackson brings to the marriage? All right, so what Jackson brings to the marriage is a lot of trauma, and I think he uses that in their favor. A colleague and I were just having this conversation earlier. When you've experienced really significant trauma in your life, it sets the tone for how you do things, what you engage with, the boundaries that you set. And for Jackson, one of the boundaries that he sets is that he is not going to stand by and watch women be put upon. This is just not going to happen. As the child of a widowed mother who got kind of knocked around by the family as a general rule, this is what he's not bringing, okay? So immediately, if you're Rachel Jackson, you've sort of landed in a safe spot, right? Like, okay, this is somebody who doesn't stand for this kind of treatment of women. I can go into this relationship with a little bit more personal, comfort and confidence that this is somebody who's going to treat me right. I think she brings that to the marriage. Jackson certainly brings passion for Rachel into the marriage. He had not married previously. This was his first marriage, and there's no evidence of any sort of significant romantic entanglement for Jackson. Now, there is a story about how he hates teaching school so much. This is when he lives in North Carolina, that he hates teaching school so much that year at the school's Christmas party, he shows up with the two most expensive prostitutes in town. It's a mother-daughter combo, and I think he does that mostly just so they will never ask him to come back and be a teacher again. I'm pretty sure that's the goal there. So whatever Jackson's young romantic pursuits are, it's nothing that's going to bleed into interfering with a marriage. So here is somebody who comes sort of unencumbered in this way, somebody who's made it clear that they value marriage, that they value family relationships, and now Rachel Jackson sort of has a safe landing spot. So I think that's what Jackson brings. He fights a duel over her, right? And he fights a duel over her more than once. But of course, this is an image down in the left corner is an image of the Dickinson duel in which Charles Dickinson is killed after insulting Rachel, after insulting a horse race. So that is where that sort of lands. And then finally, and this is completely frivolous, look at that hair. Jackson brings this sort of swoopy head full of bright red hair, which I just, for somebody who was shot and had lead bullets and had gastrointestinal disease and treated his illnesses with heavy metals like mercury and lead and arsenic, it's a wonder he had hair at all, but he's got it. So he looks dashing in a military uniform, so that's nothing to shake a stick at. I think what she sees in Jackson is a personal representation of all the things that her family had already been engaged in, right? That westward expansion, that constant, manifest destiny of driving the frontier forward. And then personally, she sees him as a partner, right? They have this incredible chemistry that just kicks off immediately. In fact, when Robard shows back up at the boarding home to get Rachel and take her back to Kentucky, he realizes how close they have gotten, just how friendly. Now, there's no evidence of it like an extramarital relationship, but clearly they have a very strong friendship and a very solid connection. Jackson even leaves the boarding house and goes to live at Mansker Station as a way of cooling some of the heat on Rachel. It doesn't really work. It comes back against him. He's challenged to a duel by Robards, which they don't fight. But I mean, he's trying to take the heat off of her in some ways. And so I think for Rachel, that's what she has needed all along. And what she brings to the marriage are things that Jackson is desperately searching for. And all of that leads to this fabulous chemistry and communication. Somebody mentioned communication earlier between the two of them. Let me dig it out. I should have dug it out of my purse already, but sorry about that. Okay. So a couple of things I wanted to just share with you for fun. The letter that you see there on the left side of the document, I found it on the Library of Congress website, and I know you can't read it, which I don't expect you to. The document is very faded and it's horribly mutilated, all right? There's holes all in it where like bugs have maybe gotten into it, or it's just been handled very casually and it's been ripped up and things. But so much of Rachel Jackson's correspondence was destroyed in the fire that burned the Hermitage in 1834 that whatever we have, even if it's in fragmented form, we're going to keep because it is what we have. So let me read to you that first paragraph. From the beginning, the Jacksons are a true partnership in every sense of the word, and their language bears that out. So this letter is written from Rachel to Andrew Jackson, February 28th, 1813. At this point, Jackson is going about east in what was then West Tennessee, or now Middle Tennessee, rounding up soldiers to support the Tennessee militia because they're about to move south against the Creek Indians later that summer. So here's what she says. So he's been gone for a time, and here's what she says. My dear, I receive your affectionate letter of the 15th of this instant, meaning of this month, so tomorrow. It was a welcome messenger to me. It bore the tidings I so often implored divine mercy to grant. I was sorry to find you had received no letter from me. I sent one by mail early in this month. I hope you will get it. I have nothing material to write, and a volume could not contain all my chat. I could entertain you with it an age. What a vacuum is in my soul when you are absent. The fullness thereof cannot make me happy. I am melancholy and my restless and hope, and then it's mutilated. You keep me alive and support me. I have our little Andrew, that's their adopted son, Andrew Jr. He is good. And then she goes on to explain that little Andrew, when he pitches a fit, looks a lot like Jackson in doing it. So my guess is little Andrew had seen Jackson's rages before. But when you listen to that language, like I have nothing to say, I have nothing material to say, and yet this volume could not contain all of my chat. Right, just being with you, talking to you. I could entertain you with it an age. What a vacuum is in my soul when you are absent. Right, and this is a common language that's used in her letters often. In fact, leading up to the Battle of New Orleans, many of her letters reflect on the risks that are reasonably faced by soldiers in the field. And she talks about that she's endlessly imploring heaven, that she's just about worn her knees out, imploring heaven that protections, that there are protections coming on Jackson, that the fullness of her soul, the fullness of her life cannot make her happy. Right, it's only his presence and his communication that can do so. And Jackson responds in kind. Almost all of their letters, they never start with anything so prosaic as, dear wife, or dear Rachel, or dear Andrew. It's always my love, my dearest friend, my heart's darling, right? It's that wonderful, private, those special, private, and wonderful terms of endearment. The document that's here on the right side of this screen is one of my favorites, and it just stings a little bit when I read it. But this was a memorandum that Jackson had, like a notepad of this, and so this is what he writes. He says, "My dear wife Rachel Jackson departed this life December 22nd, 1828, between 10 and 11 o'clock at night. In a strong hope that she sleeps in the bosom of her Savior, I will purpose to unite with her in the realms of bliss. A. Jackson." Like the fact that he even signs it, you know, like it's not, there's sort of a formality to it, right? But there's a brevity to it that just really strikes at the heart of how deeply he's grieving. There are books in Jackson's library. We have a book club, by the way, at the Hermitage. It's a virtual book club, and we're trying to read. Not always. We're trying to read through some of the books in Jackson's library. So one of the books was the book Wieland. It's a novel, and it was written by Charles Brockden Brown. It's one of the first successful novels in American history. Jackson had presented with a gift copy of it. He clearly read it. It's dog-eared, which is really wonderful. And then one of the events that unfolds in the book is that the mother is murdered. The man's wife is murdered. And on the page of this book, Jackson had placed a little little frond from a Christmas fern, just right into that book page to mark that. Because the husband is expressing his grief, you know, the fact that this is a hole that will never be filled in the rest of his life, you know, that he has lost his wife. And so Jackson, when he reads books in which those sorts of scenes happen, then Jackson usually marks them in some way or another, or reflects on them in his own writings, his letters to friends and to others. A couple of the items that I wanted to, this was a GIF. So if you're not terribly familiar with GIFs, that means it's supposed to sing and dance and move. So the corncob pipe, there was this wonderful sale on corncob pipes. And the reason I put that in there is because many of the early accounts to the Hermitage talk about how a day never finished in which Rachel and Andrew Jackson had not sat together either on the porch or in front of the fire smoking their corncob pipes together, right? So this was their, this was their special just time to be together, to reconnect, to talk. When I was a kid, my parents did this every Saturday morning, not smoke a corncob pipe, but they got up before us, you know, they had their coffee together like it was just the two of them, right? And it was just their chance to talk and touch base, and, you know, before the rest of us were up and going. And so that was their tradition, right? Was to just sit down at the end of the day and smoke a pipe together and you know, talk about the day, talk about family, talk about whatever you talk about with your significant other. The item that's here, this is a Christmas ornament that was put out by the White House Historical Association in 1988. And the reason I brought this was not to show you the ornament so much as to show you the image, to tell you about the story unfolding here inside of this image. So as you all know, I'm sure, you know, every year there's a collectible White House Christmas ornament that comes out. 1988, the year was Jackson's, and they based the story for this one on a story that Jackson's niece writes many, many years in her later life, Mary Donelson Wilcox, and she's talking about being a child at the White House in 1836, would have been the last Christmas of Jackson's presidency, and how Jackson had prepared this whole frolic and event for the children, that they started Christmas Day by getting up, and he took all of the little ones, Mary included, and took all of the little ones to an orphanage in Washington, D.C. The Jackson family children, the Donelson children, did not get presents. All the presents went to the children in the orphanage. And Jackson tells his young nieces and nephews a story about a little boy who grew up knowing what it was like to not have Christmas, to never have met Santa Claus, you know, and how, children need a chance to meet Santa Claus. And so Jackson took the little ones to the orphanage as a way of teaching them, you know, compassion and understanding that everybody's experience is not as privileged as theirs had been growing up. So he takes the children to the orphanage, they deliver toys, the White House sends over just some little food items, you know, just some little holiday snack type food, and then after that they leave, they go to church service, and then they go back to the White House in which they have their Christmas dinner. Mary Wilcox talks about having to lay down for her nap, and then when she gets up, Jackson has led the charge to turn the East Room of the White House into a snowball fight. So they had mounted on both ends of the East Room at the White House on tables, they had mounted these big tree forms in which that had been stuffed with cotton bolls. Okay, so just like they came right out of the field, right? So cotton bolls that had popped open and were white, and those were the snowballs. And so the children then spent the rest of the evening throwing snowballs at one another, right? Having this snowball fight. And eventually, once the kids were entertaining themselves, then Jackson and several others of his entourage decided to move on to adult entertainment, while Martin Van Buren babysat the kids, because they were trying to pair Martin Van Buren off with Cora Livingston, and she was the young lady in charge of the kids. So they made them stay and be in charge of the kids. But I love what that story conveys, even though there's some historic problems with it, but I love what that conveys about the sense of, Jackson doesn't talk much about his childhood, but here he is describing to these young relatives, like there are children that grow up in just abject poverty that have no idea what these traditions that their family have developed around things like holidays and Christmas, what those are like, right? And it's because of his marriage to Rachel that he's able to step into the kind of situation as an adult where he then begins to get to form some of those traditions and to have those family connections that make all of our lives, what they are. The last thing I wanted to point out here is the chart at the bottom, and I know it's a little fuzzy. I found this online, and I need to do a little more research on it, but I absolutely love it. So what you're looking at here is a family tree. This shows the Donelsons. I want to make sure can you all still hear me? Okay, I want to make sure I get this right. So this is the Donelson connection across here, right? Here's Andrew Jackson, and of course he's married to Rachel Donelson. And then it's got her brothers and her sisters, all along. So everybody there. Then so as you study out the chart, Daniel Smith is on it as well. And so you begin to see his daughter Mary Samuel Donelson, and you begin to see all those connections with many other well-known names here too, including the Butlers. And as you begin to follow that out, the author who created this chart made a point that these blue boxes, so the names are Thomas Butler, Edward Butler, Robert Richard Butler, Lemuel Donelson, John Coffey, I think that says John Brenham, Andrew Jackson Donelson, Andrew Jackson, Daniel Smith. These are men whose names show up again and again in the political dealings of Nashville, in the political dealings of the state of Tennessee. In fact, out of 31, there are 31 treaties that it takes to take the entirety of indigenous-owned land within the state of Tennessee out of the hands of indigenous people. It takes 31 treaties to make that happen. The 10 of those blue names show up on every single treaty. So even when you move beyond just, that warm and endearing family life, what it means to have connections, meaningful, permanent, lasting connections that other people can help you form. This, by and large, is the greatest single item of value, I think, that Rachel brings to Andrew. And again, I refer you back to Andrew Jackson's Southerner by Mark Cheatham. So the names here, Jackson's the leader of this gang. If you want to use gang, and I'm using that like in a Little Rascal sense, not like, the Crips or something, like the mafia, right? Like I'm definitely putting that forward in sort of the Little Rascal sense of a gang. Jackson is their leader. Jackson becomes the patriarch of the Donelson clan. Rachel is the matriarch of the Donelson clan, right? How come it's not John Donelson Jr. and his wife? How come it's not Severn and Eliza? Or Lemuel and his wife? Like, why is it the Jacksons who become the patriarch of the Donelson family? And that the Donelsons just kind of all fall in line behind Andrew Jackson. This is what Rachel brings, right? She brings this family that has an incredible network of resources right here in Tennessee. It helps to advance Jackson's own goals, where that might sound a little cynical and insidious. It's not really meant to. It's just, this is what she brings. And there's such a fit and a chemistry in this family that then Jackson is able to do what Jackson is able to do. He doesn't just come up with that out of nowhere, right? He doesn't succeed in the military and in politics and just in business because he's just that good at it. Like, there has to be other people kind of pushing behind him, right? Or helping support his causes. And that comes down to the Donelsons every single time. And because of the Donelsons then, Then you bring in the Coffees, and you bring in the Smiths, and you bring in the Butlers, and you bring in the Hayeses, right? And then now you have this enormous ripple effect of impact that starts because of their marriage. So, here's where I want to finish. This, I love this painting of Jackson. This was painted by Ralph E.W. Earl in 1831. So this is post Rachel's death. It's called Tennessee Gentleman. And when I look at this picture, like, I think the figure of Jackson is incredibly dashing. There's so many images of him where he is the foreground, where he is the largest item in the paint. He's always the largest item in the painting. But everything that you see about Jackson in this picture comes because of Rachel. And it comes because of the Donelsons. Right? And the partnership between the two families. So for Jackson to go from the Carolina frontier and a youthful veteran and a POW to being not just the president of the United States or not just the victor at New Orleans, but going from being a nobody to being a somebody, that's what Rachel does for Andrew Jackson. So I will leave that there. Isn't this better than The President's Lady? I can't tell you how much I hate that book. I hate it so much. I hate it so much. Yes, ma'am.
I'm going to tell you, the little book, Stovall Fight at the White House,
Mm-hmm.
I have. And
Oh.
it's out for it. I've had it for 50 years. It's
Yeah.
a wonderful little book.
Oh.
Well, it's at the library.
Oh, okay.
And
Okay.
an excerpt of Louise Davis stories.
And it's so
Yeah.
sweet, though. I've had it.
It's a sweet one.
Yeah.
It is Snowball Fight at the White House. There, Penguin Press. Sorry, I was making that harder. Penguin Press put out a book, I don't remember the publication date, but it's by Mary Donelson Wilcox, and it's called Christmas Under Three Flags. It's 3 short stories. One is the Snowball Fight at the White House. One is a trip that the Donelsons take. They're in Europe over Christmas, and that one is really interesting because one of the Donelsons are Presbyterian. So at one point, one of them makes the observation, people in Italy go to church on Christmas. What is up with these Catholics? Like, what are they doing? Yeah, she says as much. It's really great. So that one is, and then the third story in that was called Christmas, or The Rose of the Alcalde, and I'm not saying that right, but it's a story about the Alamo. That Mary Wilcox just kind of tacked on to the end of the book. But it's called Christmas Under Three Flags by Mary Donelson Wilcox. And I think you can find it on websites like the Internet Archive or Project Gutenberg that has a lot of public domain books that you can look up for free and just read them right there on the website. So Christmas Under Three Flags, you'll find that story in it. Yes, ma'am?
What is the story of the adoption of little Andrew? How did they get him?
Yeah. Yeah, so by the time they are in their 40s, the Jacksons had really given up hope of having children of their own. She and Robards had never had children. And there is a book in Jackson's library that I saw in looking through the list of books to choose for upcoming book clubs. And one of them is Deweese on the Diseases of Females. And it's a little stomach churning, and it's about diseases of the reproductive cycle. And the book was published in the 1820s when Rachel was, it's published in like 1810 when she would have been in her 30s, right? So there's this sense that like something's wrong. Can we figure it out, right? Can we study it out? Can it jog an idea that maybe we can take to a doctor, right? Something like that. So you even see in his library, clearly they're concerned over the fact that they're not having children. So by their 40s, they've kind of surrendered that hope, is going to happen. So they make an arrangement with Severn Donelson, who is Rachel's brother, and his wife Eliza. At that point, the Donelsons had 4 or 5 children already, and we don't know why the Donelsons agree to this. It is not in writing, but they agree with the Jacksons that the next baby Severn and Eliza have, if it's a boy, then he will go to the Jacksons, and he will be their legal heir. He will have the name Jackson, and he will be their son. Eliza Donelson then on that pregnancy has twin boys, so the older of the 2 boys goes to the Jacksons, and then is named Andrew Jackson Jr. The other twin was named Thomas Jefferson Donelson, and they marry, so they're both named like Andrew Jackson, Thomas Jefferson, it's great, but then they go to, they both marry cousins that they meet in Philadelphia. So Andrew Jr. marries Sarah York of Philadelphia, and her cousin Emma marries Thomas Jefferson Donelson. Donelson stays in Philadelphia. and lives with Emma's family. But in Emma's family, the women are in charge and the women control the money. And so Thomas Jefferson Donelson is kind of living his best life. You know, he's a kept husband is what he is. And there are many stories about, like, he starts to do something, but, you know, mom won't approve the money that he wants to spend. He's just sort of powerless, and I think he's okay with that. Andrew Jr., despite having Rachel and Andrew Jackson for parents, he would gladly have taken Thomas Jefferson Donald's place as a kept husband. Like, there's no doubt about that. So their relationship with Andrew Jr. Is a really fascinating one. It's clear that they love him, like the affection is there. You know, they call him son, he calls them mama and papa. There's a letter that Jackson writes from, not New Orleans, because Junior's in New Orleans. He writes it after the defeat of the Creek, so it's during the Creek War. But he writes a letter to Rachel in which he's kind of updating her on things. Then at the end he says, and shower on my little Andrew 1,000 kisses from his loving papa. You know, it's just, he's sort of effusive in his love and affection for Andrew Jr. And when Andrew Jr. is making such a wreck of things at the Hermitage, the tone that Jackson has with him is that of a long-suffering parent, right? Like, come on, son, I know you can do better. I know you'll do me proud. You know, I know you can just, and my dad would have snatched me up and, you know, given me a whipping, right? And I would have needed it, and so did Junior, but I don't know that he ever got one. So it's an interesting relationship, without a doubt.
But didn't they have an Indian child?
There are three, yes. So there are 3 Native American children living at the Hermitage. I hesitate to use the word adoption because there's no such formality on that arrangement. So we do not know, for the first 2 boys, their names were Charlie and Theodore. They do come from Alabama, from Creek Nation, but we don't know how Jackson acquires them. We don't know any of the circumstances of where they came from. We don't know what happens to them. They show up in like 1 or 2 letters, and that's it. So we just don't know. The 3rd boy is named Lincoya, and Lincoya, kind of like with the President's Lady, has a novel written about him in the 1950s called Lincoya. The word Lincoya, and Jackson, well, I'll get there in a second. So Lincoya is found when he's about 18 months old under the body of a dead woman at the Battle of Tallahatchie during the Creek War. Jackson's army just kind of had a scorched earth policy. Like, they were not stopping to make distinctions between combatants, non-combatants, the elderly, children, nothing. That was just, you know, scorched earth. And so Lincoya is discovered by a couple of other soldiers. They try to get the women still living to take the child, but the women, for whatever reason, won't take the baby, and so they bring the baby to Jackson. And so what are we supposed to do with this kid? We can't just leave him here and nobody will take him. And so Jackson decides to take Lincoya, and he sends him back to the Hermitage with somebody, one of his officers who's traveling back to Nashville. So he writes ahead to Rachel and he says, you know, I'm sending this little boy. He's already calling him Lincoya at this point, and he says, I'm sending Lincoya to be a companion to Andrew. So he's not enslaved. He's not meant to be enslaved, but he's also not meant to be a member of the family. He's sort of in this gray area. And on top of that, the word Lincoya is a Creek word that just means orphan. So, you know, every time like he hears his name, he's just hearing orphan, right? Like, orphan, it's time to come in. Orphan, did you get your homework done? Orphan, stop giving me lip, right? You know, so it's just, it's really pitiful in that way. His intention for Lincoya was to send him to West Point, but because of the relationship between Jackson and Congress at that point, any appointment to West Point was not likely to happen. And so Jackson decides to apprentice Lincoya to a saddle maker here downtown. And then Lincoya dies in the summer of 1828 of a pulmonary complaint. We're not sure if that's tuberculosis or bronchitis, or so we're not sure what that is. But then Lincoya was buried in the old city cemetery, part of which is still under LP Field, Nissan Stadium. I keep calling it LP Field, Nissan Stadium. So if the Titans are losing, that's probably the reason. They built on top of what remained of that graveyard. So we think that's where Lincoya is buried. But so these children are occupying this middle ground, this really great, in fact, Jackson Andrew Jr. writes Jackson a letter when Junior's traveling, Jackson is traveling, and he says essentially, Papa, like, Lincoln won't do what I say, and nobody will make him, you know. And so it's this sort of like, he's like the little lord of the manor, right? He sort of has this expectation that like, this child is here to do what I say, you know, and it's a little disturbing, right? And every sibling, right, every group of children, like, oh, they're not doing what I'm telling them to do, right? We've all done that. I had siblings. But that is repeated more than once. So Lincoln occupies a pretty uncomfortable position in the Jackson family, I'm sure. Yes, sir.
At the Harvard's bookstore, I purchased a book called Women in the Life of Andrew Jackson. I think it's by McFarland Publishing.
Mm-hmm.
I was just wondering if you've read that book, if your opinions asked at scholarship. I was looking for some other materials that might be reliable to read about, to learn more about Rachel.
Yeah, there is currently what I think is one of the better biographies that you could be reading, better than Women in the Life of Andrew Jackson, is Betty Ellison's book, and I think it's just called Rachel Jackson, A Life, right? It's just a really sort of bland title. The specific book that you asked about, though, I have very strong feelings about that book, and I am happy to share some of those privately, but it is, y'all, I don't, gotta come up with a better way to say that, or at least a less obvious way to say that. A for effort. But just the gentleman who wrote that book actually joined us for a book club. We read it for one of our book clubs, and had some interesting takes on it. He's a medical doctor by training, and so just some of the historical practices don't help in the book. But that is not me throwing the guy under the bus. Y'all just stop. But yeah, I think you have better options. Patricia Brady was a better option. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. But I will say in that book, the stories that he tells about like Rachel, Sarah Jackson, who's Junior's wife, who is the mistress of the Hermitage longer than anybody, her, Emily Donelson, I did not find much in there that was particularly illustrative. Like it wasn't new information. If you were a complete novice, it would be new information, but if you're not, it won't be. But he did have a chapter in there on Mary Wilcox, his niece. And so there was some in there some stories that I didn't know about her, and it did shed a little more light on the period in which Emily Donelson, who's serving as the hostess at the White House in Rachel's absence, she and Jackson get tangled up over the petticoat affair. Jackson banishes Emily back to Nashville, and it's Mary who sort of patches that relationship up for the two of them. So that was very interesting. So that last chapter I thought was very interesting. Was that a hand up? I'm sorry. Yeah, okay, I think you were just adjusting. Yes, ma'am, in the red.
Oh, okay. I'm not clear on the chronology of Rachel and Andrew Jackson meeting.
Mm-hmm.
She was already married when
Right.
they met.
Right.
Did she really commit adultery? What
Yeah.
and how?
Sure. Yeah. So the short answer is yes. So Rachel is married to Louis Robards in 1785. She's 18 years old when that happens. Hasn't met, Jackson's not come on the scene yet. So the Robards have been married about 3 years when Jackson does come on the scene. Jackson comes to to Nashville in October of 1788. He has been sent from Salisbury, North Carolina to Nashville to take over as one of the public prosecutors for the Mayo District of North Carolina. So he's a circuit lawyer. He came with John McNary and John Overton, and a lot of younger men were often sent out to the frontier areas to practice law because, who wanted to just move out to the frontier? Young men that are unconnected. So when Jackson first arrives, he and John McNary are living in the Donelson's boarding house, the one that's at Rivergate and Gallatin Pike. So that's 3 years into their marriage. And it's in that fall of 1788, is one of these fits of aggression in which Robards has sent Rachel back to Nashville. So she is living there when Jackson arrives. And then they just hit off a friendship immediately. But then about not quite a year later is when Robards comes back to Nashville and says, okay, Rachel, I'm here to take you back to Kentucky. And so she goes with him. And so that happens a couple of times once she and Jackson meet. But by 1791, so a couple of years after she's met Jackson, she's almost 6 years after being married, or from their marriage, that is when she decides she's had enough. So she leaves him. Rachel contacts her brothers, and 2 of her brothers come to Harrodsburg to get her. So she doesn't travel on her own. She comes, her brothers come to get her and bring her back permanently to Nashville. And she lets Robards know as much. I mean, she says, like, I'm leaving, my brothers are coming, we're headed out, like, this is over. She tells him this. And so historians for a long time, and this is part of the legend too, but historians for a long time had said, well, she didn't know. Like that this frontier communication, it's so slow, and maybe Robards told her he had done something when he really hadn't done it. And so she thought she was divorced when she and Jackson take up with one another. I don't think that's accurate at all. I just don't. I think that's been part of the way to kind of make this all look a little better in hindsight. Historians love to do that. But I don't think that's accurate at all. I think she knows exactly what she's doing. Ann Toplovich, who used to be the director of the Tennessee Historical Society, had written a series of articles about their marriage. And so you might look some of those up just for a few more of the details. But Rachel, women on the frontier were not, you know, there's always been a major imbalance in men's rights and women's rights, you know, kind of up until the modern age. Like, but in the 18th century, like there was a big difference in men's rights and women's rights. But on the frontier, all of those dynamics were a little looser than they were in cities like New York or Boston, more settled areas. Because out on the frontier, everybody had to have some independence and some agency, or things just wouldn't have gotten done, right? So women were a little more empowered out on the frontier region, and I think Rachel knows that. And so she takes advantage of it in order to just get herself out of this marriage. So in her mind, like, this is done, you know. Does it need a legal piece of paper to say it's done? Like, in her mind, in her heart, like, she's done with this. She's not going back. Legally, it does, right? That's just the law in the United States. But when she gets back to Nashville with her brothers, they decide it would be better for her to go ahead and leave Nashville again and head to Natchez, Mississippi. It's just a way of getting her out of the way. There was a large, you know, French and American settlement in Natchez, kind of just gets her out of the territory, gets her closer to New Orleans, like really just helps her catch her breath for a moment. And so they go with a couple of friends, and Andrew Jackson is one of the friends that they go with. When they get back later in 1791, they're calling themselves Mr. and Mrs. Andrew Jackson. And that is affirmed by the other people that were with them. We saw them get married. We witnessed the ceremony. Mississippi was still Spanish territory at that point, and the Spanish government did not marry non-Catholics. Like, it's a heavily, you know, Catholic community. Catholic Church doesn't marry Presbyterians. So there's no record of this at all in any way. When Robards shows up, then in late 1792, that's when it all sort of hits the fan. And so then they split and then legally marry in 1794. But I think I'm almost certain that when she marries Jackson in 1791, she knows she's not legally divorced, but maybe the law will just have to catch up. That is sort of the attitude on the frontier, like life goes on. If you have to wait for somebody coming from Richmond to tell you you're divorced, have you got that kind of time? Yes, ma'am. Sorry, I'm sorry.
When did Robards remarry and start having children?
He remarries, he remarried in September of 1792. So then that would have, but he already had a child. So it's just that Rachel went first. And so that made it her responsibility. And she didn't fight it either. And I think there's something to be said for the fact that the Donelson family, their Nashville connections, nobody criticizes her for this. And people might have thoughts about it, but they generally keep them to themselves. She's not excommunicated or disfellowshipped from the church. The community just doesn't have much to say about it. The family doesn't disown her or, you know, try to make her stick it out, you know. So I think it is probably also well known in her circles what this marriage has been like. And so for her to leave it and then marry somebody else, it's just not a thought for them, right? I really take that from the evidence. Yes, ma'am.
Is it true that he believed that she died from the stress of being accused of?
It is. So when she's buried, she was buried on December 24th. Jackson left on January 29th to go to Washington. So he's in the crunch period trying to get everything ready to go when she's buried. And when she's buried, or shortly thereafter, they had a little wooden frame structure just built right over the grave site just to protect it and mark it. Jackson leaves for Washington telling Junior, you know, you need to get a proper tombstone for your mother. You need to make this a priority. This is, you know, your responsibility as her son. Show her this respect. Well, Junior, so it never happens. By 1832, when they're expanding the mansion, then David Morrison, who's the architect, Jackson writes him from Washington and says, okay, just go ahead and design a tomb, you know, while you're at it. And all of a sudden I've lost the train of thought. Like the story counts, but all of a sudden I've lost where we were going. I'm sorry, ask it one more time.
He
Blamed her, yes, okay. So when David Morrison then builds the tomb, there's only 2 people buried in the tomb, right? It's an open air sort of gazebo looking, and it's just Rachel and Andrew. On Rachel's tomb cap, then, just the flat, you know, piece right above the grave shaft, Jackson writes the epitaph. And in the epitaph, he says, the Brady title of Being So Gentle is a quote from that epitaph, but he says, a being so gentle that slander might wound, but could not dishonor, you know, and that she had suffered these slings and arrows from the evil voices, you know, in the nation. So he very much laid the blame of that. But what I want to say is she was struggling all the way through this, right? Like it's not like she was doing fine and then it just gave out. I mean, she had been struggling all the way through this, and yet he never reflects on that. Jackson is not introspective, so he never says like, boy, Rachel's really struggling. I wish there was a way to make this easier for her, or maybe I should pull out, right? Maybe the strain on her is not worth this. Never, doesn't pose it in writing. If he ever thought it, he doesn't express it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
I love that you mentioned slings and arrows with the dress you're wearing today.
Oh, I was thinking about Shakespeare, but yeah, thanks. Thanks. I thought it was appropriate for today. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned she brought land to the marriage, but wouldn't she have lost the rights to the land when she married Robards? What happened there?
No, let me clarify that. So the land was always owned by Robards. It was not owned by Rachel Jackson. The land that Rachel brings to Jackson is in sort of a broader sense because her brothers are all land speculators and they've bought up huge tracts of land that Jackson's then able to buy at like bargain basement prices. But that particular tract that we were looking at on the state of North Carolina deed, that land was owned by Robards, and as Rachel was leaving Robards, Jackson slid in there and just bought that land out from under him. Like it went into like a tax sale kind of thing, and so he just snatched it up. And on purpose. It seems that he did that on purpose, right? That it's just a way of jabbing at Robards just a little bit more. So that document that we were looking at is very much, this is what is now part of the Hermitage up here, but it was owned by Louis Robards originally. So yes, you're right. Women did not have rights to property except in very specific cases. Certainly married women did not have rights to property owned by their husbands. So this would not have been in Rachel's title. She would not have had title to this land. Yes?
You're going to mention where the name Hermitage came from?
I will. When the Jacksons first bought the property, it was owned by Nathaniel Hayes. So it was not, sorry, let me start this over. When the Jacksons buy the Hermitage, it is part of the land that Jackson buys is owned by Nathaniel Hayes. Part of the land is owned by Louis Robards. Jackson buys both parcels of this land, and then he changes the name of it. So the name that Nathaniel Hayes had given to the property was Rural Retreat, which does not roll off the tongue in the most elegant fashion. Somebody told Jackson there's a French word for that, and it's hermitage. So it just means secluded retreat. So when you read about like the Hermitage Palace in St. Petersburg, that was meant to be the retreat of the czars of Russia, right? So that's what the word hermitage means. It's just a secluded retreat. And I love that it's called that. The irony of Jackson being like the prototype of an extrovert, you know, living at a secluded retreat is just a delight. And what I've decided that really means for Jackson is that Jackson doesn't go to Nashville. Nashville goes to Jackson. Yeah. Yes?
We're a bit new to Nashville, Tennessee in general. I get you. What is the view of Andrew Jackson by particularly Nashvillians?
It's changing. I think it's changing. And y'all correct me if I'm wrong, and I'm not a native Nashvilleian myself, but one observation that I've made is that there's a big difference between how the community around here looks at Andrew Jackson or the Hermitage and how, for example, the community around Mount Vernon looks at Mount Vernon or George Washington, okay? So I used to work at Mount Vernon. And so my observation there is that George Washington belongs to the nation, right? You get a thoroughly national portrait of George Washington when you visit Mount Vernon, okay? He's the founder of our country, the father of our nation. That belongs to all of us. So what neighbors, you know, and what story, like neighborhood stories about George Washington and the Washingtons about the plantation, Mount Vernon, those have long since kind of gone to the wayside. Here, it is not. It is very much the opposite of that. I think, you know, people are constantly coming to us and saying, you know, my family owned a parcel of land that, you know, Jackson bought originally from so-and-so. Or my family used to own a tavern in Sumner County and Jackson stopped there 3 or 4 times, right? People have kept those sorts of Jackson family stories very vivid and very real. And then when you look at the fact that every street in this town, just at least on the eastern half of town, right, is some iteration of Andrew Jackson, Rachel Jackson, Lincoln, Donelson, Old Hickory. You know, it really is, right? It's some combination of things. Over in the Hermitage neighborhood, you know, and Tulip Grove, right, which was the Donelson plantation, you get that too. But you know, you have Jackson Downs, which is the Target shopping center, and you've got Polo Place, which uses the image of Jackson on the horse as their logo. It's an apartment complex, and then you've got Rachel's Apartments, which are over off of Tulip Grove Road near Andrew Jackson Parkway. You know, so you've just got all kinds of iterations of the name all across this community. And I find that people have held on to those stories and even artifacts sometimes or land parcels strictly because of that connection. Like I went to college with a girl who now is married and lives in Mount Juliet, and she sent me a message the other day through Facebook, and she said, you know, my husband's family is descended from Joseph Rife, who was one of the builders of the Hermitage, which I hadn't heard before. And I thought, oh, that's really cool. Like, I wonder, like, what kind of stories, you know, have they passed down about Joseph Rife? Do they have any of his papers? Do they have an image of the man? Like, you know, is there some connection? And she goes, well, his grandma has got like all the old family pictures and all the old family papers. So we'll have to ask her and see what she has, right? So people, this is much more recent to people in Nashville, I have found, than like Washington and Mount Vernon, for example, in Northern Virginia. That's just an observation as somebody who's not a Nashvilleian myself. So it's led to some interesting conversations. It's led to, you know, some people who then just kind of want to argue with you a little bit, push back on some of those less than illustrious stories. And then in some ways, like people are willing to face the truth, but they're still proud of that connection, you know, and so it's been a really interesting kind of thing to watch.
Wow.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you. Thank you.
Erin is always the high school history teacher. I wish I could have it. She's phenomenal. Thank you all for coming. Have a wonderful holiday.